Like a giant wreck, SS Morro Castle has long remained in the shadow of the Asbury past despite the fact that no fewer than 137 passengers and crew members perished in the aftermath of a tragic fire, with dozens of people still missing due to operations. Climbing we'll touch on it later. Souvenirs and photographs caused the Jersey tourist community to flourish for half a year from fall 1934 to early spring 1935. Tourists flocked from hundreds of miles away hoping to catch a glimpse of the moored wreck in the wake of the tragic fire as the ship came close to shore. Enough for anyone to touch. The questions abound about the source of the fire, but in this report we'll answer it all. We'll reveal everything that happened aboard Morro Castle to unraveling the mystery of a shipwreck ashore, from exposing humanitarian crises to exposing murder plots and government plots. Yours, because this crisis will take you far with its thrilling facts. A night in memory of the Sea of Fire. The corpses of men, women and children were scattered around the remains of the SS Morro Castle, which quickly caught fire in the early morning on the Saturday, September 8, 1934. SS Morro has been a cap ship between Cuba and New York City since 1930, on a round trip starting from $65, or $1,200 at the present time. It contained decorated event halls that cost $200 to enter, about $3,800 today, to take travelers 2.5 days to get to Havana, 2 days off and then 2.5 days to come back again. This week was an escape from the next life in the midst of the Great Depression where people could party, dance, drink alcohol and gamble. The boat trip was a legal way to overcome the limit. On the evening of the 7th day of September, the strangeness began with the sudden death of the captain of the ship, Robert Wilmot, only hours before the ship began to burn in the heart of the ocean. By willful negligence in the early morning a fire broke out inside the first-class writing room when the flames began to spread and began to devour everything in its path, but Commander Worms continued on his usual course, which led the ship into winds at 18 knots. The wind speed was not very high, but it was enough to ignite the fire once more, and instead of changing direction and heading towards the shore and saving the largest number of people, the commander kept his speed in those winds. The fire reached the deck of the ship, which was covered with oil paint, and this made the fire spread along the entire length of the ship in the time it took the help a long time to reach them. Morro Castle may have already reached shore under maritime law. The captain should have ordered a distress message to be sent immediately, but the radio operator on the boat he said that the captain had ordered it 38 minutes after the start of the fire, and at the same time the captain was not the only unqualified to do his job. In general, the crew on board the Morro Castle was not capable of their tasks as well. During the Great Depression the poor people occupied jobs far from their qualifications. They were completely terrified. It was the first time that some crew members got on board the ship from the ground up. Many of them were working in places like the kitchen, the cleaning, etc. They were able to fill the ship's work ranks with people desperate for life, and one of the most powerful reasons for the accident was a series of violations related to safety and firefighting system. The countermeasures at the time proved to be insufficient while the ship was like a moving hell. The passengers were surrounded by wood that was without benefit and even besieged them more. The fire hose equipment was dismantled after one of the passengers stumbled in one of them. The fire extinguishing system was built on board the boats so that only 2 of them could be used in the event of a fire, and the other 4 would work later if the fire continued. In the event of the accident on the night of September 8, 1934, there were no lessons learned from the tragedy of the Titanic more than 2 decades ago, because the lifeboats are largely out of reach due to the late captain's preoccupation with inspecting them. When the ship began to wander, the captain ordered the crew to paint the entire trunk of the ship from beginning to end and back again until that the lifeboats were soaked with glue and they could not be lowered when the tragedy occurred. The Morro Castle had 12 lifeboats, 6 on the side. They managed to use only half of them after strenuous efforts on the last night. Tomorrow's fire. I looked at pictures of the charred remains of these boats dangling there and could not be lowered. There were no instructions to teach the passengers how to properly wear life jackets or how to go to the boat stowage area. Captain Wilmot was so keen on the happiness of the passengers that he did not want to suggest to them that they might be in danger, as a result of which many of the passengers perished. Hell floats, death on the high seas. One particularly terrifying story is the story of 18-year-old Olympic swimmer Franz de Bock, who continued to put life jackets on those single women who didn't even know where their rooms were, saying, "I can swim better than any oasis of you, so take life jackets and jump into the sea." De Bock decided to jump without a life jacket at all. He jumped off the deck, the propellers were still spinning, and his body was never found. A little later, the power lost its power as the ship stood in the middle of the ocean. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this disaster are the scores of Cuban children on board the ship. It is estimated that there were about 620 people on board this fateful last voyage. When the Morro Castle reached Cuba, there was a tremendous amount of violence in the streets of Havana. People were shooting each other in the street, and the parents were trying to keep their children away from violence by deceiving the ship's crew to take the children with them to the United States. They had taken the necessary measures to raise their children in daily homes in New York City. When the ship faced its fate, the first victims were the children because they were placed in an unqualified room. There was a lot of secrecy about Morro Castle. No one is going to talk about it. None of the crew members wanted nothing but a confession. First of all, they took a bribe to smuggle these children on board. Then they didn't want to admit that they were abandoned. Everything in this incident is about lies. The bodies of the victims and the lifeboats lined up on the Jersey shore. For several weeks, they set up a temporary mortuary there. People took numbers to see the bodies and identify them. It was very sad. On the morning of September 8th, many bodies and miscellaneous remains began to appear on the New Jersey shore. The towering inferno soon made its way to the mainland, where the residents of Asbury Pass migrated, fearing the horrific prospect. Sufficiently exploited officials sought to keep the tragedy covered for as long as possible. Where the governing body in Asbury Park enjoyed keeping the wreck there because it attracted a lot of tourists. This disaster happened on September 8th, and before that all the shops from the port at that time were closed because no one there had money to buy anything. But after the incident the shops opened again, where there were lots of people swarming on Asbury Pass and had to drag it ashore to get the spoiled cargo out. Accident or set fire? Who or what started the fire? Officially, the cause or culprit was never identified. However, historical records identified the suspect. Captain Wilmot probably didn't have any medical records indicating that he was ill or suffering from heart problems like the one he died of. There was some possibility that it was poisoned, as the captain's body was supposed to be sent to New York to test the percentage of poisoning in the body, but it didn't get there. She was allegedly lost. There were many names that emerged in that tragic incident, but the chief radio operator, George White Rogers, was the big one in that story. Rogers was one of the last people who saw Wilmot alive. He was the radio operator or in charge of the radio on the ship, and he was hired by the government. Unlike almost the rest of the crew, Rogers had a long criminal record and was charged with making terrorist threats against people he had worked with in previous posts. Manipulating the gossip, but then he told them some things about the fire that his colleagues did not know. How could he know these things if he was not the perpetrator? They could not prove the charge of setting fire to the ship on him, but he was charged with trying to kill his superior officer. Rogers died in Trenton State Prison, and some analysts believe that the government hired him to do all this, and that it hid his records from prison in order to protect him and protect itself. Exposing an intergovernmental conspiracy. The tragedy that occurred at Morro Castle is a mystery that has not been officially resolved until today. There is reliable evidence indicating that it is more than just arson, which is something that the government covers up. There is a lot of ambiguity regarding the events surrounding the accident of Morro. The first of which is the sudden death of Captain Wilmot and the disappearance of his comrades and the incompetence of his successor in managing matters and the lack of an equal investigation of what Rogers did, in addition to ignoring his criminal record and his death in prison through a brain hemorrhage and the disappearance of his file. March since 1935. In its place is an official memorial erected in 2000 and thrown directly into the Asbury Pass Agreement. It was their sacrifices that made the greatest legacy, as it led to the rewriting and underlining of safety measures at sea, the importance of training, and the strengthening of safety measures for crew members.